Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the variety of news items we have for you this week, Australia's response to avian influenza and the mass culling of domesticated birds. A study indicating that there is a reason why some people do not seem to get COVID-19 despite it being theoretically something that should infect everybody. A simple solution to the excess of sodium in the current Western diet. An alarming change that occurs when magic mushrooms or shrooming is decriminalized across most of the areas in the USA where it's been legalized. A novel potato that's genetically engineered that appears to be superior to all other potatoes. Oil protesters in the UK vandalise the oldest stone monument that we have common knowledge of, that being Stonehenge. A rather funny math joke regarding sin and pi. A once-in-a-lifetime astronomical observation involving what could effectively be described as an explosion. Voyager 1 is back to life after a period of rather alarming concern. And Earth's inner core is slowing down. China plans to build the world's largest particle collider in 2027. YouTube testing its own version of Community Notes, and a London movie premiere cancelled due to the script being generated by an AI. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with the next emerging zoonoses, avian influenza, and as mentioned, Australia's response. In Victoria, or one of the states in Australia, the decision has been made to cull over 1 million birds, specifically talking for the most part about chickens, and this is in an effort to stop the spread of avian influenza. The downside to this is several-fold. One of the simplest is, there won't be as many eggs available. This will inevitably drive up the prices. The second effect is rather more telling for some people. Either your chicken nuggets, tenders, or whatever you wish to have won't be as readily available, because meat birds will also be culled. On one hand, the response makes sense. You are basically killing off any bird that's currently known to have it, and those that are in the immediate vicinity. The problem is that domesticated birds like chickens are one thing, but wild birds are another, and so, assuming that these birds have to any extent managed to free roam or been exposed to wild birds, there is a decent chance that the birds will have wound up being infected, and this will spread the disease despite killing off nearly all of the currently available birds that they know have it. But it won't remove the disease from circulation. This means the biosecurity action won't really solve it. And, as mentioned, it will have carry-on effects to food security. In fact, this can be demonstrated by the fact that the control zone that's meant to prevent the spread of avian influenza only covers 6 of the 7 farms that are about to have all of the chickens culled. It is worth noting that it doesn't seem like the plan with this is necessarily to stop the spread entirely. In fact, it's largely meant to reduce its impact and the rate at which it spreads. This, of course, doesn't mean much when you consider that, you have all these chickens now being culled because maybe infected, but also now ducks as well, and sadly, it's full-grown, ugly ducks. Interestingly, this is in stark contrast to other countries, for example America, where a similar sort of phenomena is happening, where America is more or less just living with it. Australia has taken a more extreme approach, which is a part of the more extreme biosecurity requirements of the country. In other viral news, we have, in this case it's actually pneumococcal news, and it's a vaccine for adults. Now, pneumococcus is a disease that's not particularly pleasant, and generally speaking, certain age groups are more vulnerable to it, largely thinking of the very young and the very old. For the very young, there are vaccines available, to an extent anyway, but mostly it's avoid infection and get treated. But now we have a vaccine for the elderly, which is good because you don't want to be treated for it. Treatment generally involves use of antibiotics, and antibiotics are rough on everybody, especially with the increasing number of pneumococcus strains that are, to be blunt about it, relatively resistant to antibiotics. Even if we aren't talking about something that's antibiotic resistant, the elderly tend to be weaker in various ways. Lower liver function, kidney clearance function, so on and so forth. So giving them antibiotics tends to be bad for them at the best of times, but necessary evil if they get infected. An infection which is both less likely and likely to be less severe if they're given the vaccine. It's worth pointing out that this is arguably not a small market or cohort who would benefit from the vaccine. At least in the USA, there's about 150,000 adults each year who get hospitalized. Theoretically, each of these hospitalizations would therefore get a booster shot or a subsequent vaccine to help them get over this. This would drastically help with the 14% fatality rate, somewhere around the 20,000 a year mark. Going on to COVID-related news, we have a study looking at why it is that some people just don't seem to get infected, and how this could theoretically be used as an advantage in terms of developing vaccines. Now, there is some evidence that certain people just do not get COVID-19, and the study here looked at 36 healthy people who had never been infected. What they found is that their immune system has a particularly quirky way of dealing with COVID-19, and to a certain extent, it more or less does what the vaccine's already doing, but they obviously don't need the vaccine because their body is already doing this. The data, if accurate, and certainly if it can be extrapolated out to other people, does indicate a way for us to take the current vaccines and effectively make them more powerful, or more effective if you will. If you've been infected with just influenza, for example, and you've had a particularly nasty strain, you would know what happens when you get infected with a virus. You get inflammation, a runny nose, you feel terrible, you're tired, all sorts of things, and you're just barely coping with the combination of fluids and pain relief. Well, that's a systemic response, and it's drastically different from what's being seen with this particular study. Normally, COVID-19 would have the same sort of phenomena as with something like influenza, that whole raft of symptoms, but individuals who appear to be resistant to it don't have the same widespread immune response. Rather, it's much more localized and much more subtle. If you will, think of it as dealing with the infection right away and right where the infection can occur, rather than trying to deal with it after a delay and a subsequent, more general response. Next we have what is a interesting case study out of Canada. Not necessarily a unique phenomena, but nonetheless interesting. It's a Canadian woman who developed brewery syndrome. Brewery syndrome is where the body effectively creates a fermentation vessel in either your GI tract, or in other cases something like, for example, your bladder. This is generally going to be a response to consuming a reasonably sugar-rich diet and a commensurate yeast infection. Combining yeast and sugar in a relatively anaerobic environment like your digestive tract or your bladder leads to the production of ethanol, and ethanol is an alcohol, hence the name brewery syndrome. You're literally brewing your own alcohol. Typically, the two categories you'll find are those who are just consuming a high sugar diet and have consequently developed brewery syndrome, or those who are diabetic. Now, the distinction is that in the case of diabetes, it's generally found that the infection occurs within the bladder, and that's because a lot of glucose finds its way into the bladder as it passes through the kidneys, and the yeast then causes the production of ethanol, whereas with non-diabetic patients it tends to occur in the GI tract. Fortunately, treatment is straightforward for the most part, that is antifungals, assuming you can treat them in time. If you can't, it can lead to fungal sepsis, and sepsis is not good. In other news, we have modern problems needing modern solutions. This case, it's the widespread increase in sodium in food. This is in short a result of the increase in the amount of salt that's being added to most food we consume today. And not just the small amount you sprinkle on top of your meal, but it's in a lot of things, especially that which is pre-packaged. The solution as it's proposed is to simply add potassium to salt. Now, salt by itself is just sodium and chlorine. A lot of salt now does already include iodine, and this was in response to a problem identified in the 1960s where the world was effectively low on iodine intake. Now you can get non-iodized salt, but iodization has been the general trend. In this case, adding potassium would have several effects, one of which is that it would increase the rate at which the sodium is cleared from the body. And the second effect is that it would, to a certain extent, help in, let's say, counteracting some of the issues around that increase in sodium. Mostly the increase in blood pressure due to the retention of water. It's the osmotic effect. Assuming that you don't die from hypertension, you're going to live at least a longer life as a result. But that may not be the only factor, and this is where the next article comes into play. It's the identification of various parts of your blood that could be contributing to a longer lifespan. Admittedly, longer may not be better, but still, longer. The study was looking at people who basically live to 100. They're otherwise known as centenarians. A shorter, more complicated way of saying they live to 100. Century, centurion. That's the general gist of it. The work was based in Sweden and looked at about 44,000 Swedes who had health assessments between the ages of 64 and 99. Now, this is useful, not just because it's a large cohort, but because it's a fairly long time frame. After all, 64 to 99, that gives us a lot of data to look at. And a lot of these people were followed for about 35 years, so again, we have plenty of data. About 2.5% of these people lived to be 100 years old, and unfortunately the majority of them were female, so this does skew the data set. It makes it slightly more difficult to figure out whether or not it's purely just that females live longer, or that there's something else going on with the data. Nonetheless, 12 biomarkers related to inflammation, metabolism, liver function, and kidney function appeared to be a major factor. They also found that, well, rather obviously, malnutrition and anemia were considerable factors, but, well, that's basically a sign that you're not healthy or that you're not eating enough, and the two are not unrelated. So you can sort of throw those two away. The findings when they looked at these particular biomarkers were fundamentally that those who survived the longest had stable levels of all of the products that they were examining. Things like glucose, creatine, and uric acid. There wasn't any great variability between their measurements at any given time, which would make sense. The more stable the body is, the less stressed it will be, the longer it would theoretically work before having to replace cells, for instance. So it makes sense that the more stable your life is, the longer you will live. Despite this, it is worth noting that the difference between the two groups, those who lived the longest and those who didn't, wasn't very much. In fact, it's only a 2.5% on average. That means that there's only a fractional difference between those who will live to 100 and those who die young, which is a problem, simply because it's really hard to be able to get that kind of difference in any appreciable manner, or at least artificially induce that kind of difference. And next we have research based on Beethoven. Now, this research is arguably, let's be generous and say, questionable, since much of the hair that's been attributed to Beethoven is definitely not Beethoven's hair. And that's for a simple reason. DNA sequencing of those hair samples has found that they're female. Now, modern politics aside, you can't change Beethoven's sex randomly. He was most definitively a male. As such, finding female DNA in the hair is a clear indicator that it wasn't his. This brings us to the findings as such, and it has to do with what was within the hair itself, and it had to do with metals and other toxic products. These would indicate, if again it is actually Beethoven's hair, that he may have been exposed to various metals that were causing some of these problems that he had. For example, he had severe abdominal pain at times and chronic bouts of diarrhea, neither of which can be much fun. This brings us to the findings, and the fact that what they found is actually the hair was indeed from a woman, and therefore not Beethoven's hair. It does, however, mean that the woman in question probably had some of the same issues, given simply that, well, they were poisoned with lead. Moving to other news, we have the results of decriminalizing, or legalizing if you will, magic mushrooms. Now, psilocybin or magic mushrooms are pretty much illegal across most of the world. There are places where they are allowed in various circumstances, but for the most part, you can consider them illegal. This doesn't prevent people from consuming them, but nonetheless. In parts of the USA, however, there's been a shift to legalize them, and this has been on a very small scale. For example, individual cities, or occasionally whole states, but for the most part just cities. And this has been part of the larger process, let's say, of shifting across from the war on drugs to the control of drugs. The problem, as explained in the conversation, is simply this. As you legalize magic mushrooms, more and more likely it becomes that younger people will access them. This is exactly the same phenomena as, say, with alcohol, tobacco, and so on. The legalization means that they can more easily get it, and therefore they have a degree of curiosity that leads to consumption. The problem is, especially with adolescents, that, well, they may not be so ready to cope with the consequences of consuming this magical substance. This includes hallucinations, psychotic states, and more. Now, we should point out that this study is over a 10-year period, and it's not exactly the best data set, as the researchers themselves admit. Nonetheless, despite not being the best, it's currently the best study that we have available to describe and explain, to a certain extent, what's happening. Over the 10 years in which they were looking at this, there are about 4,000 magic mushroom exposure incidents for people who are between the ages of 13 and 25, which is a concern. Now, before decriminalization, these numbers were relatively stable. Understand, we're not talking about a huge change over that 5-year period, but after the laws changed and they were decriminalized, there was a massive increase. And it's important to note that there was a year-on-year increase. That is, for every year the law was changed, it became more and more likely, particularly amongst those under 18, that they would be consuming magic mushrooms. At least according to the dataset analyzed, about a quarter, if not more, of all of those, both adolescents and adults who were consuming them, required medical attention after consuming the magic mushrooms due to the effects. These are things like hallucinations, delusions, agitations, heart rate problems, confusion, and eventually something like a psychotic break. So, no, not good. This is not to say that there isn't a place and use for them. It's just not very clear what that place or use is, and certainly with the relative degree of access and the issues that are generated, there are questions raised about how it's been executed and the problems therein. And next we shift to the humble potato, another cash crop of a sort, except it's the genetically modified potato made at Michigan State University that appears to be the best potato yet, or at least so is claimed. The advantages of this new potato, otherwise known as the KLA 91.3 or Caucasica potato, is better than others simply because it can be stored in cool temperatures for a long time without development of things like sucrose. Now, generally speaking, what you want in a potato is starch. The starch is the potato's way of storing energy, and when you cook it, it will be converted to things like sucrose, which is fine when you're going to eat it, but not for storage. If you store it like this, it's a problem, because it goes bad much quicker. By having effectively a shelf-stable for a long time potato, it's beneficial for the stability of the food supply. You can ensure that they remain available for a very long time. This brings us to an interesting article from Wired about why it is that we're eating potatoes wrong. Since about the 1990s, potato consumption has been going down. At its peak, there was a consumption rate of about 30 kilograms or 64 pounds of potatoes per person each year, at least in America. This has decreased, and partly because, well, potatoes are expensive, as is just about all fresh produce. But more importantly, people are just cooking them the wrong way, at least according to Wired. they should perhaps consult Samwise Gamgee on how it is that we should be using our potatoes. Probably if you're going to cook them with fish as well, but nonetheless. Something that's quite significantly affected the potato, at least in America, is that most potatoes grown are relatively limited in their variety. But there is a wide variety of potatoes available, and these varieties will then affect what you do with them. Now, the white potato is the most common potato, but within that, there are variabilities again. For example, those who have a waxy skin, those that are more starch-rich, and so on and so forth. Each of these can be cooked in different ways, and if you don't cook them the correct way, they obviously don't taste as good. And this will affect what you get out of it. If you don't like it, you won't eat it, and therefore, you are effectively abandoning what is a very calorie and nutrition-dense food simply because it tasted bad, and understandably so. Further, due to the fact it's largely made of starch, those same potatoes provide at least a more stable release of energy throughout the day or night, and this is down to the fact that it does take time for the body to break down the other parts of the starch that weren't dealt with by heating and provide it to the body in the form of glucose. Further to the simple fact that you have the white potato, you do have a variety of other potatoes available in a variety of colours, purple, orange, and so on. This is often the skin coloration rather than the fleshy in part, but you can also occasionally find that the fleshy inner part of the potato is also very coloured, which can add diversity to your plate if you so wish. Next we have what is effectively the stupidest example of climate and environmental protest we've seen in a long time. This goes beyond the idiots gluing themselves to the roads, for instance. It's the Just Stop Oil protesters who sprayed a paint-like mixture all over Stonehenge in an act of vandalism and protest. This is not going to help them in any way, shape or form. All it's going to do is piss off a whole bunch of people who view Stonehenge for what it is, an archaeological marvel and something of great historical merit and value. Not something you should be damaging for the sake of trying to make a message that isn't going to be accepted now. The irony of ironies in all of this is the claims by one of the protesters involved, which is, as quoted, "It's time for us to think about what our civilization will leave behind. What is our legacy? Standing inert for generations works well for stones, not climate policy." Yet, they're literally vandalizing that same history. In what way did they think this made sense? It is arguably one of the dumbest ways to protest. If they had protested by, for example, gluing themselves to roads, it's at least related to the use of fossil fuels. If they targeted oil refineries, they get charged with terrorism, but again, related to oil or fossil fuel consumption. But no. Going to something that does make more sense, a new way to represent pi. Pi as in the mathematical formula, not pi as in the food stuff, although we'll get to the pi food shortly. It's a new way of showing it in terms of calculating the mathematical constant of pi. A pi being an irrational number, a number that just keeps going. There's no end to it. You can round it up and stop it, but if you were to continue to calculate it, you would have to keep going, more or less forever. Now, for the average person, this isn't going to have any real value. But if you're in physics or similar, this can be rather important, as you can plug in their expression, so to say, and be able to incorporate a fairly complicated process with a very short symbol, making it much easier to be able to shorthand your equations, and therefore effectively communicate what you're trying to say, unlike us, with a very simplified explanation, until you go to do it yourself, in which case it becomes nightmarishly difficult. In other pi news, we have the interesting observation that although eating too much cake is a sin, eating too much pie is not, because the sin of pi is always 0. The sin, or more accurately sine, of pi. It's a wordplay in mathematics, which, yeah, it's puntastic. In other news related to sin, of a kind anyway, we have the disaster that will be Louisiana. Louisiana schools are about to be forced to include the 10 Commandments in their classrooms and similar. The problem with this is that it breaches the separation of church and state part of the Constitution. And more importantly, there's already a lawsuit to stop them from doing so. Now, the problem with this is going to be fairly straightforward. The law, and case law more importantly, is clear. You cannot do this. And given that they're being sued, they're about to be in a situation where they lose a court case they have to defend, that will cost them a fortune, and then they'll have to pay the opposing party's fees because it's clearly something illegal and unconstitutional, and ultimately it will cost them money. And that money will come out of the education budget. An education budget that's likely already strained, if anything, about America's education and the way that adults are able to understand basic concepts in science, technology, engineering, and maths is to go by. In a much more simple version of this, Louisiana has just decided to spend a fortune defending a case that they will inevitably lose, and at the expense of students' education, since the budget that would go towards that will be spent on lawyers, just getting paid to go through the motions. Going to news that those same students may not ever be able to appreciate, given their lack of education, we have a new gel that's very much like glass, but also it can heal itself. By itself, this development may not have any applications, but in time it will. First, because it is a gel-like product. The second is that it's glass and therefore a liquid. But more importantly, the fact it can self-heal. This means that if you damage it, it will be able to fix itself and therefore continue to serve its purpose. Think of all those cracked window panes that would not be cracked if this were being used. Of course, we can talk about it in a much more significant context, for example, skyscrapers where replacing windows is very difficult if they get damaged, or in the case of some places, just shatter and fall off buildings. The reason this works, for the most part and in very oversimplified terms, is that they've created what is fundamentally an ionic liquid, that is, a liquid full of ionic compounds, whether it is charged particles in the form of pure elements, which is unlikely, but that would be similar to, say, sodium chloride or salt, or more accurately and more likely, larger structures, such as polymers, that create ionic bonds where different parts of it connect to each other due to the attractive forces, that ionic force. Where this gets kind of weird is that it's more a gel, but even as a gel, it's only 50 to 60% liquid by volume anyway, and this means that it remains relatively tough despite all the other damage that can be done to it, and it also means that once the liquid inside element is exposed, it can, to an extent, heal. Still, this is very early in its nature, and very early in nature itself as the publication. Shifting to astronomical news, we're going to be seeing some interesting phenomena over the coming weeks, months, and arguably year. This includes what should be anyway, a very spectacular light show, but only if you're in the northern hemisphere. Unfortunately, if you live in the southern hemisphere, you're out of luck. The phenomenon involves a star called T Coronae Borealis, and not to be confused with the Corona Borealis event, the light show itself that's the Northern Lights. In this case, the explosion as such will become, at least temporarily, one of the brightest objects in the night sky, and very visible to the naked eye. Better yet if you have a telescope, but nonetheless. The reason this will be so amazing is that it's going supernova, or more accurately a classical nova, but the classical nova is just a particular type of supernova. You might wonder, how can we be so sure that it's doing this? And the reason is simple. It's reliably done so every 80 years for the last 8 centuries. So you're more or less not going to see this again in your lifetime. Well, that is unless you're one of those really long-living Swedes from earlier, in which case you might well do if you're young enough. Why this occurs is described as being a result of the star in question having formed a white dwarf, a incredibly shrunken down sun, or star, and it has a companion nearby from which it can siphon off hydrogen. Now, as it siphons off that hydrogen, it also gets compressed. But eventually, that hydrogen gets detonated, and that detonation or ignition is what we see as the rather violent nova. Not nova from StarCraft, but nova as in astronomical nova. In other light-related news, we have just how heavy a particle of light can be. Now, theoretically, light shouldn't have mass as such. It's just going too fast, and the mass that it does have is practically negligible. But it has now been measured. Now, the photon, which is that particle of light, has a mass that is 9.52 by 10 to the 46, negative 46 mind you, kilograms. So that is, if you were to try and write this out, it would be 0 and then 0.46 zeros, followed by 9.52 kilograms. The issue here is that, well, photons are at least classically considered to have no mass to them or whatsoever. It's either it's light and therefore it's incredibly fast but has nothing to it, or it's got mass but it's slower. And this is the dichotomy. You either have one or the other. But if it's true that a photon has mass, it's going to change things quite significantly. After all, photons are, classically at least, considered to be able to pass through most things, and if they don't pass through them, they impart energy. They don't actually add anything as far as mass goes to whatever's receiving the photon. But if there was mass, now things change. The problem with this now is that although we have a theoretical limit, we don't actually know if a photon has mass. We just know that this is the, well, according to the research, established upper limit for what it could be. In terms of how this could be important, well, it's going to have some pretty serious implications if you look at, say, a plasma, where theoretically electrons and similar could be interfering with anything that has mass. In other astronomical news, we have Voyager 1, and although headlines will read it's back, no, it hasn't returned to Earth, it's just begun broadcasting once more. And this is good, because the Voyager 1 is a long way from Earth. It's 24 billion kilometers away, billion with a B, or 15 billion miles if you so wish. And it's been travelling for decades now to get that far. As such, our ability to do any kind of troubleshooting or maintenance is more or less non-existent. The problem with it is not that it hasn't been travelling. It's continued to travel out of the solar system at a steady pace. The problem is that we weren't getting the data from that, and there are at least 4 sensors on board that are meant to analyze the universe as it travels. Now we're beginning to get that data again, so thankfully things are resuming, sort of anyway. The challenge now is to hopefully be able to salvage the data that was being analyzed since late last year, but also hopefully, and this is the big hope, prevent it from happening again. To understand just why this is so difficult to be able to fix is not just that it's incredibly far away. That alone, and to be clear about it, that is one of the major troubles, is not the biggest issue. It's the age of the craft. Understand that the craft itself was sent out in the 1970s. It's 46 years old. This means the hardware on board is absolutely ancient by modern technological standards, and that was the challenge in getting it fixed. It was established that one of the chips on board had managed to cause the malfunction, but nobody currently has any idea how those chips work. They were forced to go back to those 1970s manuals to figure out how they could sort this out. So think about what it would be like if you had to try and start a car that required a hand crank, or some sort of TV that only had knobs and dials rather than a remote. There's a good chance that you might struggle, depending on your age. As such, there's a similar sort of problem with Voyager 1. The staff responsible just didn't know what to do at first, and, well, NASA's managed to overcome that hurdle, for now at least. In the last piece of astronomical news we have for you, it's that it's possible, and let's be very clear about it, it's only a suggestion from the study, that gravity can exist without mass. Now, this is going to run very much contradictory to your classical physics, your Newtonian physics, and to a certain extent, Einstein's theories, let's say. That is, gravity requires matter and therefore mass to exist. You can't have one without the other. This is where the study in question presents a contrasting viewpoint. Now remember that this is, at least in theory, just that, a theory. A part of what drives it is the argument of dark matter, but dark matter's never actually been proven to exist, so we have a slight problem there, mostly because we've never observed it. There are plenty of models that can account for it and use it, but none have ever actually been able to observe it. In fact, dark matter and the lack of any direct evidence for it has been the fundamental reason why this theory was proposed. The simplified version of this is that if you find that there is a gravitational difference in an environment, completely unrelated or at least detached from the presence of matter and therefore mass, it would indicate that there is a certain amount of gravitational presence or force without the presence of any mass or matter. The way they're presenting this is that you have what is effectively two concentric shells. Think of nesting dolls, if you will. The innermost part of this, let's say, is a positive mass, whilst the outermost layer is a negative mass, and so when you have these two put together, you come out with a sum of 0, effectively countering each other. This would still exert a gravitational force, but there'd be no mass to measure as such, because the two have counted each other out. The real-world evidence that they claim supports this is the various shapes of galaxies, for example, ring and shell-like formations, which is an interesting argument to make, mostly because it is at best suggestive of the principles described, and at worst is simply a random correlation and causation. Shifting back to Earth and something more grounded, quite literally in this case, and it has to do with the ground that we sit on, or stand on, or however you happen to be positioned, and the very most inner core. Earth's inner core is slowing down, which isn't that bad, unless it stops, in which case we now need to get some plucky miners, a nuclear bomb, and send them to the center of the Earth. Or maybe that's just how Hollywood describes how it works. Other than being a odd phenomena that it's happening, and understand the research, although confirming that it's happening, doesn't really give us much information beyond this, will have one small impact on your day-to-day life. Your day will get gradually longer and longer. Now, this effect won't be really pronounced for the first year, 10 years, 100 years, but it will gradually add up, although we are talking about fractions of a second. In other news that would be looking at fractions of a second, in fact probably even less, China's plan to start building the world's largest particle collider. Now, this is a $5 billion facility, and it would be bigger than the Large Hadron Collider in Europe by a significant margin. In fact, it would be 100 kilometers in its circumference. The plan with this is that because it's so much bigger, they can run particles that much faster, because they can speed them up more, they could then find the mysterious Higgs boson. Although they said the same thing about the Large Hadron Collider, so yeah. The concerns with this are several-fold. The first and the simplest of it is, well, Chinese construction is not necessarily the best. Plus, as we mentioned last week, there are all kinds of issues around academia and questionable findings, let's say. And finally, what happens when you have a combination of dodgy research, very questionable construction, and the ability to open a portal to hell? Oh wait, no, that's Doom. Going to other technology news, but this time Russia, and Russia's plan to be able to produce 28nm chips by 2027. Now, understand, modern nanochips, as in the current generation, are going to be hovering somewhere around 7nm. So Russia aims to be able to produce, 5-6 generation old nanochips by 2027. And they hope to be able to make 14nm by 2030, which, given that that's about 6 years away, and the rate of current technological growth, there's a good chance that their chip production will remain at least 10 generations behind the rest of the world. The reason this is a requirement is straightforward enough. With the various embargoes, sanctions, etc., Russia hasn't been able to source what they need. And when you consider the possibility that West Taiwan may invade Taiwan, there is a good chance that the rest of the world may not be able to access modern microchips of the same level. Even with the, let's say, older generation designs that they're looking to be able to produce domestically, this is still an incredibly expensive endeavor. Understand, microchip facilities are not cheap, nor are they easy to build. Just making one that's as old as they're going to produce is going to cost nearly $40 billion. Yeah, it costs that much, and that's ancient technology by comparison to what something like TSMC in Taiwan is making. And understand, that's also on the premise that they have an accurate estimate, which, given cost blowout to government projects, is probably not the case. For now at least, based on the current production capacity of Russia, they're only able to increase, and understand that increase is probably a generous term for what they're making, 90 nanometer chip production, and that's still going to cost them $5 billion to increase. Going from the hardware side of things to the software side of things, the US government has begun a lawsuit against Adobe for its subscription-based models and the difficulty in cancelling it. Now, we have to wonder whether or not somewhere in the US government an individual tried to cancel their subscription and found they couldn't, and this is why that's happening, or if they actually do give a damn about consumers. It seems more likely to be the former rather than the latter. Adobe has been using a subscription-based model for the last few years, and unfortunately this has effectively created a problem for consumers who are beholden to the terms of service, and when suddenly something changes, you have two choices. Either just accept it, which sucks, or you can choose to decline or cancel your subscription. The problem with Adobe is that, well, they set an annual price, but you basically pay in monthly installments. And the problem with this is that because you've effectively signed up for an annual plan that you pay for in parts, you either have to continue paying throughout the rest of your subscription period, or you have to pay to leave early, and these early termination fees are where things get to be questionable. It's the onerous and complicated cancellation process that involves going through multiple web pages, declining multiple pop-ups, and then dropping an early termination fee on you at the very end, which then discourages people from cancelling. Effectively, Adobe has taken the old cable television approach of, oh, are you sure you want to cancel? Oh, that's so bad, you can't get what we're offering you anywhere else. It's South Park in a nutshell. Or, in other cases, the telecommunications companies, when they have what is effectively a monopoly over a region, and you can't go with anyone else but them. Live services are not the only platform or service that are undergoing a particular government regulation at the moment. Google has had to change some of its behaviors recently in response to European Union digital competition rules, and it has aggravated users, unlike the FTC's decision to sue Adobe. The problem here is that Google Maps is no longer as user-friendly as it previously was. It used to be that you would search somewhere on Google and it would give you a map address, and when you had this, you would be able to see easily what it is. But no, now you need to go through an extra step to be able to get to it, and it makes navigating to somewhere somewhat more difficult. This is part of a wider suite of, let's say, challenges to Google as an overall company, more accurately Alphabet as an overall company, in recent years from Europe. The intention this time is to see whether or not the actions by Google are actually following the law, which is a fairly major thing they should be doing. But if they are following the law, it's now more difficult to use. Further to following the law, or at least if not the letter of the law, certainly the spirit, it's also intended to increase competition from smaller tech providers, which is another element to this that, whilst yes, beneficial, probably not being done the best way possible. It is noteworthy that Google is not the only company that's receiving the same level of attention. Apple and Meta or Facebook are also getting a similar degree of, intensive observation. As Politico writes, this may also be an example of malicious compliance on the part of Google, where they are deliberately choosing to do what the governing agencies in Europe have told them they have to do, but in such a way that it makes it so the users are unhappy, when they could have done this in a different method that would be less aggravating to your average user. In other things that would aggravate your average user from Google, YouTube is going to start its own version of Community Notes, which this could be interesting, mostly because Community Notes basically has any post by Elon Musk marked as being something that's not really what it is. But above and beyond this, well, it could be useful depending on what happens and how well they execute it. As we previously described, something like citations for Wikipedia were a nice idea, but executing them wasn't. That's because Community Notes relies on a sort of proprietary algorithm that decides which notes to show based on a fairly ubiquitous and cross-spectrum support for a particular note. Over the coming weeks and months, we'll see whether or not this rolls out on a wider scale, as for now it's only going to be US-based and only available in a app format. Now, the final news we have for you is also technology-related, but also the juncture of technology and society. It's a movie premiere that was cancelled. Not because the movie itself was bad or anything else, but because the script was generated by an AI. There is a certain irony in the fact that the movie's being cancelled, partly because the actors, director and all that have already done their part in making the movie. But the actual movie itself is, somewhat ironically, a movie about a screenwriter who has found that AI has superseded their ability, and, as such, gives them a existential crisis. So on one hand, what the let's say protesters have done is, ruin the work of all the people who were involved in the movie. On the other hand, given that the movie is effectively a satirical, self-reflective piece, they've pretty much done exactly the opposite of what they wanted. And that's a painful irony. An irony that, given the way AI is going, it might even be able to appreciate now. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.